If you don't clarify your core values and what you really stand for as a human being, what you really believe, then you're easily manipulated by pithy phrases, emotional logic, and you end up voting for things or participating in things that you are like, oops.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Salty Pastor Podcast, a podcast dedicated to helping you learn and grow in your faith and learn some critical thinking skills along the way. Your faith journey is something that you must do on your own. It's not something you can have delivered to your doorstep for you, but instead it is something that you
can't outsource it, baby.
You can't outsource it. You can't hire a trainer for it. You have to do it yourself.
But the best thing you'll ever do.
It is the best thing you'll ever do. And we want to come alongside you to encourage you, to challenge you, to entertain you a little bit, and to help you learn those critical thinking skills so that you know why you believe what you believe and can defend it when asked. My name is Jesse Maher. I'll be your host, and we cannot do the Salty Pastor Podcast without the Salty Pastor himself, Dr. Douglas Peake.
Good to be here, everybody. I'm so glad you're listening today. We got a lot to tackle today. I don't know if we'll have time to get through it all, but we're going to try.
Our outline is quite massive, so I'm excited to see how quickly or unquickly we cruise through this. So we are tackling our new series, My Political Jesus. We are in the third week of it. On Tuesday, we talked about our responsibilities as an individual in the political structure as a Christian. Last week, we talked about what the church is supposed to do and what their mission is, and this week we are talking about what we're supposed to do as individuals. And I think this is kind of the crux of what a lot of people want to hear about is we've heard about what the church is supposed to do, and then you delineated that we are not. The church's mission and our individual missions are different when it comes to politics, and
intertwined but different.
They're intertwined but different, and we need to discover what we're supposed to be doing, not what the politicians tell us we're supposed to be doing. So, Pastor Doug, take us away. What are we doing? It's application day. I want to hear it all.
Let's get down. Well, let's get specific. As a follower of Christ, what is my responsibility as a citizen in America? And I think what happens is you can start answering those questions once you clarify your values. It makes it so much easier. First of all, I think, number one, the biblical value is we're to submit to the governing authority, and in America, that's a constitution. So every person who takes following Jesus seriously in their life should vote. That doesn't mean you have to go and vote for every single vote that ever exists. You don't have to vote on the dog catcher in a special election. However, you should endeavor, if at all possible, to vote. You shouldn't discount your vote, discredit your vote, devalue your vote. You shouldn't do any of those things. You should say, if I have means and opportunity, I should vote. That means I need to inform myself based on my core values. I think this is really important because people today tend to shortcut their voting preference to someone they like or someone they think. And so it's like a celebrity orientation. And that's because if you don't clarify your core values and what you really stand for as a human being, what you really believe, then you're easily manipulated by pithy phrases, emotional logic, and you end up voting for things or participating in things that you are like, oops. And I don't know if you remember, but a long time ago, a couple years ago, you had asked me, well, what do you think about this BLM movement and stuff like that? And I said, look, I've been a modern day abolitionist for a long time. I take a real dim view of racism, which my record stands on that. And it violates the biblical principle, the core value that we are all created one in Christ. Paul even says this to the Galatians, that there is no barbarian or Scythian, meaning there is no ethnic differences. There's no religious differences. We're all one in Christ. So that's a very important thing. And I said, however, BLM is not that.
Right.
And you were like, okay, I've never heard this before. This is radical. And so I had to explain to people what the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory was and where it came from and how the leadership of the BLM movement was steeped in this. And they even said this, that we are modern day Marxists and we're using this to advance our Marxist ideology. And it was like, oh, but all these churches had jumped on the bandwagon. And it was like, Okay, then afterwards, when all this came out and people started to realize what it really was, a lot of pastors were doing the backstroke. And so I'm like, well, if you understand your values up front, and if you don't have to know everything, you have to be Einstein IQ and remember every fact out there to make good decisions because you know your core values. And what'll happen is if it doesn't quite ring right, you'll ask yourself, I wonder why. So we must submit to the governing authorities, vote, and be educated voters, because our founding fathers said you need to be educated and you need to practice your civic duty. I read some of those quotes from our founding fathers on Tuesday.
Right.
Second of all, what happens if your society, America, is doing something that's wrong? And because of the way the Constitution is written, it seems to make it permissible. Or when the government does something that violates the Constitution. For instance, if we look back in history, the most famous is the Dred Scott decision, when they decided that people who were of the ethnic origin, they were black, they were not allowed full citizenship because they weren't fully human. Okay, this was a total violation of the Constitution, and it was overturned on constitutional grounds, right?
Right.
But more than that, if the Constitution allows for something, then it is important to follow how to change the Constitution. There's a process laid out in the Constitution for doing it. So I can submit to the authority of the Constitution and change it because it actually allows for that in Article 5. It's called the amendment process. I don't know if you know that today there are 27 amendments to the Constitution of the United States. There have been 33 amendments proposed, voted on Congress, passed by Congress, signed by the president at the time. However, not all have been passed. Only 27 have been passed because they must be ratified by a majority of the states, like 2/3 of the states. And not all of the states have done that. That's why it is a difficult process. It's intentionally laborious in order to amend the Constitution, okay? But let's talk about the process and how the church historically actually has influenced the amending of the Constitution. The one that comes to mind for me is the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. Now, if you go in and you study the historical beginnings of it's called the women's suffrage movement, what you will find is it was started in the church. And there were all these women's societies that cropped up in churches all throughout the United States. They met in church buildings. They met with the blessing and encouragement of the leadership of these local churches. And what happened is they started to gather momentum. And then when the 19th Amendment was passed and voted on by Congress, it was voted on by all men, right?
Right.
So it's really interesting that based on Peter and Paul's admonition of how to do it, they followed their admonition and submitted to the governing authority of how the Constitution works, and it ended up resulting in the 19th Amendment. So I think that's really important to understand that the reason why we can't even discuss politics today with your neighbor or anybody else is because people, it's become such a toxic thing because people put all their loyalty in a candidate, thinking that their guy, their gal is the answer and the cure-all. It's like a celebrity that they almost worship their candidate, get them in control so they can have all the power, instead of putting our loyalty where our founding fathers intended it to be, and that was in the Constitution, not individuals. And we don't have a king and we don't have a monarchy. We're not to put our faith in individuals, right? We're to put our faith and hope in the Constitution. And I think as Christians, if we start doing that more, then that's going to take a lot of the toxicity out of the division that we have over politics right now.
So, I mean, we are really seeing in America right now this toxicity you're talking about,
yes,
this
very
divisiveness, and how no one really ever talks about, well, is it constitutional? Other than like the lawyers who are trying, the lawyers or the judges
They'll
who are
argue,
trying to, and that's their job. And so it's like, it's all based on preferences and executive orders, which are, out of control these days. Every president increases the amount of executive orders that they're trying to one up each other.
Yeah.
And those technically are part of the Constitution, but also kind of not. And it's very weird. And so it's just turned into this big preference game of I want to shove my ideology through. And no one in America and everyone else in America is also going, okay, well, the politicians are running ahead of the Constitution, so we'll just run ahead of the Constitution. And we're just going to fight for what we believe in our ideologies and not go back to is this even part of what we're supposed to be doing, right?
Yeah, which comes back to the notion that we've talked about. This is the result of deconstructionism, where words don't have meaning.
Right.
And since words don't have meaning, then I can shove through whatever I want, and then I can find a way to rationalize it in the law. I think the thing that's most recent is President Biden is doing something incredibly unlawful, and that is he's forgiving student debt. And it's like, okay, so it's been estimated anywhere from $500 billion to $1.5 trillion. So he's going to spend upwards of $1 trillion. Simply one man is making this decision. The Constitution is written specifically. It was written to not allow that to happen.
Right.
Their whole reasoning behind it is this. Well, the pandemic gives me special powers.
It's what's the phrase I'm looking for? Basically, in times of emergency, I can do whatever I want, which is the same thing we've seen in other governments where somebody takes over during a time of emergency and then just never ever relinquishes that
That's
power.
Right. They just turn into a dictator.
Yes.
Well, I still have emergency powers. And so that's what's happening. Now, if you're a fan of Biden and you voted for Biden, you like his policies, you have to have enough intellectual integrity to admit that what he's doing is really, really bad. Because what happens when the person that you're opposed to on the other side of the aisle gets elected? Because it always goes back and forth.
Right.
Then that person,
the pendulum swings both ways.
Both ways. So then that person is going to one up him.
Right.
And it's
Biden did this, so therefore it's the same thing with the executive orders.
Yeah.
The previous president did 150.
Yeah.
So I'm going to do 175. And now we're up into some ridiculous amount.
Yeah, it's just crazy. And so that's why you're paying $5 a gallon for gas, and that's why milk costs 3 times as much as it ever cost before in your life.
Yes.
There's a direct correlation to this. Why? Because our faith is in people. It's not in the Constitution anymore, and we're no longer a society driven by laws. And the Constitution was designed to limit the power of people in order that the people could solve their problems, and that tends to force us to get along with each other, because you need me and I need you to solve this problem.
Right.
But now what has happened is we have said, well, I'm just going to root for my team and they can win at all cost. And then we walk away thinking, aha, I won. I'm the ruler of the universe. And then you realize, oh, we got a game next week.
Right.
And what happens when you lose? And what happens is it bifurcates the society. You see, it pushes, people are no longer in the middle. The middle gets smaller and smaller. People are being pulled and pushed and manipulated to the extremes. And that's not good for society, because everybody becomes suspect of everyone else. And so I think, that's because we've put our faith in individuals and not the Constitution.
Right. So let's talk about our next segment. I mean, really, this comes down to basically values, right? We've gotten into a situation where we're basically fighting over ideas, and the ideas don't necessarily have any value based to them. It's, they said this thing and it sounds good to me. Like, I have student debt. I'm all about not having to pay back money every month. I would love to have that. And so the idea is great in theory, but then we go back and look at the values and look at what it's really going to cause. And then you start going, okay, well, maybe this idea isn't as good as it sounds right now.
Yeah.
So,
well, and that's just the issue, is that, in regards to that specifically, is that most politics now are emotional appeals. And because people haven't been trained in economics, they go, well, in principle, it's not good to give this away, but I have $50,000 in student debt, and if they're going to wipe off 20 grand, that's pretty sweet. So this one time, I'll just let it slide.
Right.
But what you don't realize, because no one's been trained in economics, is that inflation is 100% caused by Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
It's 100%. And what it is it is a tax. It is a hidden tax. And so what happens is by pouring that money into the economy, you have inflation, 8 to 10 to 11% of inflation. And so that basically means that $1 for you 18 months ago today is worth 88 cents.
Right.
And so what happens is you say, well, that person who says, well, they're just going to let me pay less. Guess what happens? You end up paying more. So you're paying more because inflation goes up, the cost of goods get more expensive. And so, wow, I got $10,000 off of my student debt, but guess what? I pay double for gas. Right. I pay triple for eggs and meat and food that I have to have when you're going to heat your home, like especially on the East Coast when they have to go buy heating oil to heat their homes. Yeah, that's going to be a shock of shocks. And so what's going to end up happening? I got $10,000 off my student loan, but now everybody across the board is going to be paying an extra $2,000 to $3,000 a year due to inflation, and that never goes back down.
I was gonna say we've never seen that. We've never seen cost of living really regress after an inflation.
So do the math. In 10 years, if you're paying an extra $2,000 a year because of inflation, in 10 years you paid 20 grand to get $10,000 off your student loans.
Right.
Now, is that an exact one-to-one correlation? No, but there's definitely a causal effect. So the most important thing we got to do to understand this is clarify our values. When you clarify your values, what you believe, why you believe it, your frame of reference, it makes decisions quicker and easier. For instance, do you have to go through all the economics to understand that principle? Well, you could. But what if you don't know anything about economics? And what do you know of all that? What if you just have a basic value of integrity and honesty and say, I took out that loan. I don't expect anybody else to pay it back. I took it out. It's my responsibility.
Right.
That's a basic core value, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
But now what people are saying, well, I want the government to take my responsibility away. When is it ever good for your government to take over your responsibility for your life?
Well, and it's the same values we've been seeing, or the same philosophy of I should never be held accountable for myself. Like
Correct.
My suffering, my happiness, everything about my life is influenced by other groups of people around me, either positively or negatively, which is where we see the CRT and all these different things happening, right? And so this is just an additional step in that direction of, well, I took this money, but I shouldn't be held responsible for having to pay it back. The government should do it for me. It's not my fault that I had to go to school. It's the government's fault, I guess. I don't know.
They made me sign up.
Yeah, they made me. And so it's like, it's another step in that same ideology that we've been talking about, where it's like, it's no longer my responsibility to be responsible for myself. It's somebody else's.
Yeah. And then you get influenced by that. The Bible in Proverbs, it says that the borrower is servant to the lender. So when you're borrowing from the government, you're taking this stuff from the government, then when the government speaks or says something, right, it influences your thinking and core values. And so if you clarify your values ahead of time, it keeps you out of trouble, number one. But number two, it makes it extremely difficult for people to manipulate you based on emotions.
Absolutely.
In Ephesians chapter 4 with verse 12, it talks about that Paul says these people are leaders in the church designed to, verse 12, equip you for works of ministry or service, so that the body of Christ may be built up until we all reach unity in the faith, in the knowledge of the Son of God, and become mature. So see what he's saying? Is we have to have a knowledge. Clarifying your values is a head activity, right? And then he goes on to say, we must become mature, attaining to the whole measure of the fullness of Christ. Then we will no longer be infants. And then listen to what he says. We will no longer be infants, tossed back and forth by the waves and blown here and there by every wind of teaching, and by the cunning and craftiness of people in their deceitful scheming. Okay? So we are no longer influenced by the cunning and craftiness of people in their deceitful scheming. Instead, speaking truth in love, right? We all grow to and become every aspect a mature body of Jesus, who is the head. So today, I think this is really important because we can apply it. People today are wondering, well, is our public school system really adopting lots of gender ideology? Is this really going on? I mean, how much is actually happening in my public school where kids are being, taught gender stuff and queer things? And so there's a lot of questions out there. And I think it's really important to understand that the answer to that question is yes, it is. Okay, it's going on at an alarming rate. Is it going on in your local school? I don't know, but I can tell you, here in Virginia, here's an article about Virginia before, when it was Attorney General Mark Herring who was voted out, is that they had a Virginia Values Act, SB 868. Okay, and talks about it there. Here in Nebraska, the governor warns parents that proposed sex ed curriculum being proposed for the state of Nebraska will teach LGBT ideology from kindergarten to 12th grade. Here is another article about it happening in, this is California. This one is happening, no surprise there. Here's one that's happening in Chicago. It's called Equity Week, and it's all about LGBTQ related teaching materials gain tremendous momentum in the school systems. Here in Houston, Texas, they're teaching it, and they took a bunch of kids to the local Houston Public Library, and it was there for drag queen reading a story hour. Well, it turns out that the drag queen that was reading story was charged with, he was a registered sex offender, and he was reading kids' books to kids. Wisconsin, here you go. Here's another one. It's happening in Wisconsin. Here's another one. It's happening in, this is Diversity Day. It's happening in the Gorham Middle School. I've got so many of these things out here, I can't even read them all, Here's one for LA. Here's one for Portland. This is indoctrinating students to become LGBTQ activists in kindergarten through 5th grade. That's your elementary school. Vermont, they found out there's a lot of sexual indoctrination happening in most Vermont elementary schools. This one is teaching homosexuality techniques for children in Northern California. Here's one in Florida. Florida school district suggests hiding transgender identity from parents so that parents are not. Here's one. This is called the, I can't even get the article here. It is the G.A. Stetson Middle School. I believe this is in Massachusetts that's going on. And so there is a LGBTQ curriculum on Pride Day at the school, in the middle school. They asked all the boys to wear dresses to school in support of it. Here is in Idaho. I mean, this is kind of hard to hear, but even in Idaho, where we are from, there's been some stuff going on. I don't know if you know this, but in Coeur d'Alene, in the North Idaho Pride Allowance's Pride in the Park celebration that they had up there, what they is now, they're being reported, they did have a drag queen for a kids drag queen hour. It was a family-friendly event, and a drag queen was up there on stage, and he wasn't wearing any underwear, and he lifted his skirt and exposed his genitals to the entire crowd. They even have pictures of it now. You can go and see that. I mean, that doesn't seem like a good thing to me, and so I think it's something that we should be concerned about and take note. And the question is, well, how in the world did we get here? I mean, how did we get from there to this? This just seems really interesting to me. And, well, the reason we got here is it happened in 2012 to 2016 in the same-sex marriage argument. You see, arguments matter. Values matter. And the argument basically went like this. Love is love. Who disagrees with that? Do you disagree with that?
No.
I don't. Love is love, right? Okay, love is good. Since people are born this way, telling same-sex couples that they can't do what you do as a heterosexual couple is discrimination. Okay, when you first hear that, you go, okay, I think that's true. They're not being allowed to do something that I do based on something that happens from birth, right? That's their argument. I'm not saying I agree with it. Okay? Well, so they said we need marriage equality. Who's for equality? Are you for equality?
Everybody's for equality.
Everybody's for equality. When it comes to marriage, do you want marriage equality? It sounds pretty good to me. I don't know if it sounds good to you, but that sounds good thing to me. Yeah, I want marriages to be equal. Yeah. Okay. In a sense, so you think emotionally, I'm engaged in this. And no one ever stops and asks a question, am I being manipulated? Because what happened is, in reality, same-sex attracted couples already had the exact same rights as you. There was no marriage inequality. There was no marriage inequality. They had the exact same right as you and everybody else in America did. What they did is they redefined what marriage was. And so before that, everybody had the exact same right. In other words, you had a right to get married. Are you married?
No.
Okay. So even though you're not married, you had a right to get married.
Correct.
Okay. If you were a person attracted to somebody of the same sex, you had the same right. I can get married just like everybody else. It's equal. It's just I have to marry somebody of the opposite sex. And there's reasons why that is true, because marriage is between a man and a woman, right? That's what it was for 10,000 years of recorded human history. So what happened is what they were doing is they were saying, no, because I am attracted to somebody of the same sex, I want to create between us in order to validate this. And Andrew Sullivan, who's a thought leader, he's also a leading homosexual activist. He said that my lifestyle cannot be validated until the government recognizes my right to marry. So he made that argument. But what they did is they asked for a special right, not an equal right. This is the same thing as somebody born and raised in England. Do you know what side of the road they drive on in England?
The left side.
We drive on the right side. They drive on the left side. So this person moves to America and they say, my preference is to drive on the left side. So I want you to make a law that says I want the right to drive on the left side. So what would happen if you had people that was their preference, driving on the left side of the road when majority of people are driving on the right side of the road? What does it create?
Chaos and
anarchy.
Collisions.
And that's exactly what's happening now. But more than that, what people don't realize is that the argument went on to say that same-sex marriage would not have any implication on any heterosexual marriage. In other words, why is it what I want to do in the privacy of my life affect you and your marriage in any way, shape, or form? So it was passed in the Obergefell decision. Justice Kennedy wrote the opinion. And what happened is that became the legal basis for the National Sex Education Curriculum, which includes all of this radical gender identity. It is written for the purpose of accepting all queer, bisexual, homosexual behavior, and it is based upon the legal right to do this is based upon the same-sex marriage decisions. So in essence, they argued for a special right. The Supreme Court created this right out of thin air, and the implication was anti-discrimination cases against flower shops, bakers, wedding event centers, caterers, etc. All right. The issue wasn't, can I get flowers for my same-sex marriage ceremony? You can. There's tons of them out there, but I'm going to go after that one because they're discriminating against me. So what it became is a club, a fascist club to impose their values on everybody else. And it started to win initially, okay? And it started to gain ground as a legal precedent. That is what became the basis for the sexual education standards. And if you notice, if you go to the National Sexual Education Standards put out by our federal government, right there on the introduction, it says the goal of these standards is, and I quote, ground the educational experience in social justice and equity, honoring the diversity of students, racial, ethnic, gender, orientation, ability, socioeconomic, as well as academic, and promote awareness, understanding, and appreciation of diversity and inclusion. So these are the national standards sent out to every school system. According to them, 50% of all school districts, not quite 50% of all school districts have adopted their recommendations. And right there it says that our goal is to honor the diversity, their sexual orientation, and everything else, their gender orientation, and that's the basis for why they're teaching these curriculums in your elementary school. This is the legal foundation for it, and if you oppose it, then you're considered a person who is phobic. You're gender phobic, homophobic, transphobic. You are a bigot. You are a discriminatory, narrow-minded person. How did we get here so quickly? It goes back to the Supreme Court decision, Obergefell, which created the legal foundation for all of this to occur. And that's how we went from there in 2015, 7 years later, now to where they want to teach your kindergartner that they have any gender identity that they can think up.
So, I mean, something that my current generation is really struggling to see the connection between is sexual freedom expressed in these things like same-sex attraction, and how that has potentially flowed down into sexualizing children. That is not a connection that my generation specifically really wants to engage with or talk about. They say, nope, they're unrelated. And what sexualization of children? They're fine.
Yeah, and I think it's important to understand is that in the doctrine of non-coercion, if I sit down and I talk to a person who might be struggling with same-sex attraction, or they might be dealing with, I've sat down with people who are dealing with attractions to people outside of their marriage. I've talked to people who don't want to get married but want to be sexually active with people all the time. I don't see any difference between those. They're all related to the sexual drive, right?
Right.
And so I have conversations with them. I'm not here to force you. I can't tell you anything, but let's dig into the real reasons why God is instructed this. It has to do with your identity and where your significance comes from. And we have these deep spiritual conversations. And I want those to continue. And so I understand why your generation is open to that. But part of the reason why your generation is open to that, in my opinion, is because you have these people with these radical ideologies trying to use emotional arguments to manipulate your generation to believe certain things. And that is, well, if you don't agree with their position, then you're discriminating. And your generation is very concerned about being labeled someone who is homophobic or discriminatory. Right. You've been convinced that every bad thing that has ever happened to a person who deals with same-sex attraction happened and is a result of them being stigmatized by Christians or society. That's just not true. The facts don't say that. The research doesn't say that. However, that's the buy-in. But what's happening is my generation, which is where a lot of the fight for what they would call homosexual rights started, people my age are starting to see the connection. And I want to show you a video of this gal. She's a lesbian, and she was an activist fighting for gay rights. And she sees the connection, and notice what she says.
So here it is, the most unpopular opinion I'll ever do. I hope you guys duet and stitch and save or whatever you need to do to this, because it's going to get down fast. if I would have understood when I was younger that fighting for my rights as a lesbian would mean allowing children to drag shows, attaching child molesters to our community, and allowing children to change their sex before they even know what their favorite color is. I would have never done it. Never.
Well, there you go. That's pretty powerful stuff when people are starting to draw the connections. And so I think that that's something we need to do and realize where we're at now. And that's because we haven't clarified what our real values are. And because we haven't done that, we've so many people who consider themselves Christians have been manipulated by the world. And so, we're here now. And so we've got to figure out a way, a course out of this. And how do we do that? How do we chart a course and we take some pretty difficult stands against this type of behavior? Well, we partner with people like this, who's a lesbian. I call it, we could be co-belligerents in this, right? Boy, I agree with you,
Right.
Let us partner together to get this. As a consenting adult, I don't want to control your life, right? I want you to discover God. I can't make you. I can't force you. You got to do it on your own. I pray for your journey. I will answer your questions as much as possible. I'm not going to hate you. You shouldn't hate me.
Right.
And my opinion today is that almost all the hate is coming from you better affirm what we want to do no matter what. That's where most of the hate is coming from. I don't see it coming from the church. Every once in a while you find a wackadoodle on YouTube, but I mean, that is so rare.
All sides have extremes,
Yeah.
right?
But it's just so rare. I don't know of any church right now that would say, "Hey, you're welcome here. We're not going to affirm it, but you're welcome here, and you're going to be treated like a normal person." Because we don't see that as who you are. We see you as a person, as a human being, and that's what's important to us. So I think we got to figure out a way to chart ourselves out of this, and it's going to be tough and it's going to be difficult. But we have to be courageous and do it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Pastor, for sharing all this with us. I know we probably could have gone another 10, 15 minutes just talking about more things that you want to do. And maybe that's something we can pick up on next week and just kind of finishing up some of these thoughts you had. But I know that this has given me pause for thought on some of the things and how something that seemed so innocuous can very rapidly be taken up and then used to go to an extreme length. So we just need to be thinking about those things as we're making choices, whether it's student loans or something else. You have to really think it through, critically think all the way to the end position of where could this go and how could it be? And am I okay with those outcomes? So we appreciate you guys. We hope you're having those same discussions, those same thoughts about where certain things are going on in politics and where they could go and how your involvement as an individual can influence these things and needs to. So thank you guys so much for joining us. Join us on Sunday as Pastor Doug takes some more thoughts of these things of what our mission is as an individual in politics and kind of wraps them up in those biblical terms and shows us the way forward. Thank you guys so much for joining us, and we'll see you on Sunday here at Foothills Christian Church.
Blessings.